Painting metallics and getting them to look real can often be a challenge. How do you take that bright silver Grey Knight armour and twist it into something dark and gritty? That's exactly what we're going to be figuring out in today's video. I'm Nate the Feral Painter and welcome to the Grimdark Compendium. So let's first talk about the model and the build itself, as in my eyes the Grey Knight models don't quite cut it for me and are in desperate need of a range refresh, especially to keep up with the newer size and the bulkier models that we're seeing on the market. So for this I've turned to two kits specifically to kit bash it with the addition of some additional elements, and for this I've used the Space Marine Librarian in Terminator armour and the Grey Knight Captain Castellan Crow. The kits themselves do go together quite well, using the Librarian as my frame and then just adding some additional parts. His helmet was taken from the Dark Angels Knights kit, and the spear and his weapon that he's got in his hand, this was a 3D printed spear. However, the Custodes kit will work really well for the spears in this as well. Decorated around the miniature you can see parts from the Grey Knight model that I've chosen, and also I've used some candles, some 3D printed ones, but these are regularly available on most Etsy stores, and even Green Stuff World sell these in kits as well. The tabards or mementos oaths that you can see wrapped around the miniature, for this I've turned to one of my favourite products, which is some copper sheeting. This just allows you to cut them up and turn them into some interesting shapes, and what's nice about these is they are pliable, so you can move them about, wrap them around parts of your model, and also if you're going for more of a dynamic pose where the wind's blowing, these will work really well as well, because you can pose them in a way that the wind is blowing them. But it's just a case of building it up around your model, and I've also used parts from that original Grey Knight kit to help me build the base. So the bulk of this tutorial is going to focus on the iconic Grey Knight silver armour. It's what defines them, and it's also the biggest challenge when you want to push them into the Grimdark style. For this I'll be diving into the products I've chosen, why they're perfect for what I'm trying to achieve, and how to get the absolute best out of them. The main paints that I am going to be focusing on, especially on this first stage, are the AK True Metal waxes. I've also picked the gunmetal and steel colours specifically because they've got a colder bluish tone to them, which fits that Grey Knight's theme perfectly. Now what makes these AK products so useful is their versatility. They go on as a paste, almost like a waxy substance, and once they're dry you can polish them back with a cloth or a cotton swab. That gives you a natural metallic shine that lets you control whether the armour looks polished and where it looks dull and worn. And because of their texture as well, they also are brilliant for adding some scratches, some wear and tear, and patches of contrasting tones. Perfect for that battle-scarred demon hunting look. But of course, they're not without the drawbacks. They can take a little bit longer to dry compared to regular acrylic paints, and they do require mineral spirits to thin them down. That'll create its own challenges when we come to the weathering stages, but I'll show you how we can overcome these a little bit later on in the video. But if you give them time and work towards their strengths and combine these with other techniques, the results are some of the most convincing metallics that you can actually get. So with all that said, let's dive in and break each step down. Once we've built our model, we're going to prime it in our favourite black primer, and then after this I'm going to get the AK True Metal gunmetal and load it onto my palette and come in with some mineral spirits just to thin that slightly like we would with an enamel or an oil paint. We're just going to treat this as though it is an acrylic paint, so how you'd thin your acrylics with water, we're just going to do the exact same thing but thin it with mineral spirits. I then come in with a large brush, a flat brush or a dry brush will work really well for this situation, and just as evenly as I possibly can start to apply the product to the model. We want a nice thin even coat, and if you do require two or just an additional coat over the top of that, then you can do that as well. We're just trying to get this as even as we can without clogging any details, which is why we thin it slightly with mineral spirits. And I'm avoiding areas which are going to be painted a little bit later on, like the flag and the tabards and any other parts that, you know, that we don't really want this colour to go on. It's not really going to affect it with what we do a little bit later on down the line, but just ultimately I do try and avoid these areas when painting this miniature. But it's just a case of going on there and getting those first two thin coats all around his armour sections, and then we're going to come in with a blow dryer just to help and flash off that mineral spirits and speed up the drying time of this layer. Now typically I did say they do take slightly longer. It's not a massive amount, they're very similar to enamel, so however fast enamels dry, that's sort of how these paints are going to dry as well. So a good couple of 30 seconds to 60 seconds on a blow dryer, and that layer is going to be dry, ready to start painting on the top or manipulating it even further. Now I did say at the beginning that these paints have a unique property where we can come in and start to buff and polish that surface to a high shine. And to do this I've just grabbed a cotton Q-tip, or you can use anything like a cloth depending on the surface that you're doing or the size of it. And I just come in gently with that Q-tip to buff and polish that surface. And you'll see as we work our way around, it's almost starting to get that mirror finish. Now what's unique about this is because some of that paint will actually come off a little bit because it's not fully cured, I'm going to use that to my advantage. And because we are buffing it in sections and it's going to miss some slightly, I actively encourage missing some of those surfaces. Because what this is going to do, you can have some areas that are a little bit duller, and then some that are really polished, and some that have got that mirror finish. And for the parts that slightly wipe off, we've got that black primer underneath, and that'll show through very slightly depending on how thick or thin we've applied that layer. But all those come together to give you a really nice, unique, mottled, finished, polished surface. And that's where these paints really come into their own. Now one thing you will get if you're going to do it with a Q-tip is you will get inevitably some of these little fuzzy hairs and stuff around it. Just make sure that you spend a little bit of time just going through and picking out some of those parts, as when it starts to cure you don't want them to settle into the surface. Now even at this stage the metallics look absolutely incredible due to that unique AK True Metal paint. However, we do need to push this even further, and I'm immediately going to come in after I've completed that polishing stage with a cool temperature filter. This is because the Grey Knights do have that like blue tint to their armour, and to achieve this and just shift that tone slightly even though we've used some colder tones, I'm just going to come in with a blue shade through my airbrush, sprayed from the bottom upwards, so it's almost like a reverse zenithal. So I'm just going to be catching all those under layers and those shadow areas, and I just spin the model round and work my way around just to fire that very subtle temperature shift up onto the miniature. The reason I've used some washes is because of their transparent nature, which will allow that true metal shine to still show through. But it's also going to do something else to our model as well. It's going to create a very slight thin additional layer that we can then now start to apply some soft pressing to this armor. You can do this without the filter, but with the filter as well, it just creates an additional layer that when you scratch through it, it reveals that surface, that metallic surface underneath, and just adds that little bit more to that mottled and scratched surface. And because of those waxes, even though they're dry, they're still a little bit soft, and we can start to scratch through those as well, revealing that black underneath. Now with soft pressing, you do require something like a really light sharp tool, such as a paper clip, an airbrush needle, or anything along those lines. It's just important that you come in with soft pressure, just because you don't want to be actually taking all those layers off or even scratching back through to the plastic. It also helps if you've got some zoom goggles, and just remember to work in scale with the miniature, as you don't want to do your scratches too large or to them look out of scale. So all we've done here, we've done the initial work first of all and got those nice polished surfaces. Then we've come in with a filter from below, like a reverse zenithal, and added that to the model. And then after that we can just come in with a sharp tool and just add some additional scratches. Now even this on its own still looks incredible, but we can push this even further with the next few stages. But there's one thing that we do need to do before we move on to those additional stages of weathering and applying some additional base coat colours, and that is to seal everything in with those true metallic waxes. As I stated right at the beginning, they do have a few issues, so if I were to come in now immediately over the top with some enamels or oils, that's going to interact and reactivate because of the mineral spirits that they've got inside them with that true metallic, and it's just going to make a really big mess, which is what we want to avoid. So to overcome that, I'm just going to give the miniature 2 thin coats of a satin varnish. I specifically chose a satin varnish, one because it still retains a little bit of shine, but also it's going to seal everything in to that miniature and lock all those paints in to avoid any further reactivation of the additional products that we're going to apply over the top. At this stage of the painting process, it's a good time to paint in some additional base coats or pick out any additional details before we move into the weathering. As I did mention earlier, the real focus of this video is the metallic armour, but it's just worth quickly covering the other base coats and colours that I've used. For the red elements, like the flag and some pipes, I went in with AK Dirty Red, and all of the golden details were done with Scale 75's Necro Gold, and I'll explain a little bit later why I've chosen an acrylic for the gold at this stage. But the skulls and tabards were base coated in 2 thin coats Dragon Fang, and then highlighted up with 2 thin coats Vampire Fang. The candles were given a base of Vallejo Dectan, and from there I just finished off any remaining small details around the model. So it's just a case of just blocking in and painting the model up to a standard finish, but refer back to the paint list at the beginning for a full breakdown of these colours. But by this point you should have everything that we've laid down at the start, plus these additional details, all ready for the first stages of weathering. Just before we continue, I wanted to take a moment to tell you about the biggest and best deal we've got going on right now, the Trench Crusade Complete Series Bundle. This incredible discounted bundle includes a full course on all 6 Trench Crusade factions. That's 24 detailed episodes packed with hours of build guides, kit bashing tips, painting recipes, and advanced techniques. You'll also get the officially licensed Trench Crusade Villainy Ink enamel set, which comes with 2 exclusive new colours. You'll get instant access to all 24 Trench Crusade videos, and the enamel sets will start shipping in January 2026. Head to the Grimdark Compendium today and take advantage of this huge discount. It's the best way to support us and the work that we do here. To kick off the weathering, I start with a unifying wash made from Villainy, Goon's Grime and Decrepit Filth. I mix both of those enamels together 50-50, and then I thin that mixture down 1-to-1 with mineral spirits before loading it into my airbrush. And as for this application, I have used an airbrush to lay down a controlled, even coat, building up extra layers in areas like the lower legs where I wanted a heavier build-up. If you don't have an airbrush, there's no problem. This step can easily be done just as effectively with a brush as well. The reason I have combined the Goon's Grime and Decrepit Filth is to create a tone that both dark enough to sink into panel lines and recesses, while also resembling the natural dirt and grime that would naturally accumulate over time. After around 15 minutes of drying or using a blow dry to speed up that process, it's time for the reductive technique. To do this, I've used a makeup sponge or a cotton swab, lightly dampened with mineral spirits, and I carefully reactivate and lift that enamel, pulling it back off the miniature or pushing it around to create some variation. Then this is exactly where that satin varnish from earlier becomes essential. Without that protective coat, the enamel would have just broken down those metallics underneath and caused everything to muddy together. But when finished, the armour has a convincing build-up of grime and filth that looks like it's naturally formed in a hostile, war-torn environment. For a deeper dive into the reductive method though, please check out a dedicated video here that we do have on this channel. Moving on now to the next stage of weathering, and I'll be working with oil paints to add some further modulation and variation to this miniature. For this, I'm going to be using a mix of techniques with the oils such as blending, streaking and some oil dot filtering, but to put it simply, oils behave a lot like enamels. They have a longer working time, easy to blend, and they can be used to shift or filter the surface colour with little effort. I've chosen a selection of earthly and rusty tones, placing them around different parts of the miniature. Dark oils are thinned down to run into some of those recesses to deepen those shadows, while rust tones are applied to pipes or used as subtle tints. I like the idea that some of the mechanical parts are breaking down, catching rust and corrosion, while the armour itself remains intact, hinting at decades of fighting and wear. If you'd like a deeper dive into oils and corrosion effects, I've got a full video on that here on this channel. But the key thing I want to stress is how approachable oils really are. They're forgiving, flexible, and fun to experiment with. If something doesn't look quite right, just simply wipe it away with clean mineral spirits and try again. For this model, my goal wasn't to bury the miniature in heavy weathering. Instead, it's about those subtle shifts in tone, extra depth in the shadows, and small touches of variation that make the armour feel more cohesive. Let the oils dry naturally, no varnishes are needed at this stage, and if they do start to react with the enamel layers underneath, that's not a problem at all. In fact, the interaction often creates even more richness and variation in those tones. After the oils have had time to dry, you'll probably notice that the armour has lost some of its shine, and that's completely normal after using all those weathering products. And to bring it back, I'm going to return back now to the AK True Metals. I start off first with the steel colour, roughly sketching in highlights across the armour, and at this stage I'm not worried about being too precise, and sometimes I even dry brush it quickly to pick up some of those edges and some of those raised details. But once the highlights are in place, and what I am going to do then as well is for that gold, which is the reason I used an acrylic first, now because we've got that gold on there already, we can now do the exact same thing but with AK True Metal Gold. But once all that has been completed and the highlights are in place, blending them is quite simple as well at this stage because they do behave a lot like oils, and we can manipulate those waxes and even blend them further. I'll just go back over the surface with that cotton swab like we did in the polishing phase. So we're going to do two things here. We're going to blend and polish those true metallics, and it'll just help and soften and feather out those rough marks whilst also giving the highlights that natural reflective sheen. Because the wax hasn't fully cured, it blends into itself beautifully. As long as both the oils and waxes were applied quite thin and you do give them plenty of time to dry, they won't interfere or interact with one another. But even if that, or in any case that interaction does occur, don't stress about it. It can actually create some extra variation in those tones, and you can simply reapply more wax if needed. But even though we've subtly blended out those metallic highlights, I still wanted a few of those sharper, crisper edges to really push that metallic effect. And to achieve this, I've turned to Meloto Liquid Chrome. It's a unique product with an almost mirror-like chrome finish, and you can either get it as a pen, but I much prefer buying those refills, which this case will just let me go in there with a brush for more control. The paint is alcohol based and it can be thinned with alcohol if needed, but just use it sparingly and just on the edges or as some additional scratches, and it'll just help and push that armor and just give it that extra little pop that the Grey Knight armor needs. Now finally, to finish this model off, I'm going to add some glow effects to the eyes and also the weapon. To make these stand out, I'm going to first lay down a white base. This can either be done with a brush or an airbrush, and it'll just help boost that final brightness that we're trying to achieve. But like I said, on that weapon I did use an airbrush, and this will just help create that soft glow effect. And then on top of that, once that has dried, I'm going to apply a transparent layer of any contrast paint that you desire over the top of that white. And this works just because the contrast paints are translucent, that white will shine through, and this will just result in giving you a quick but convincing glow effect. However, if you want this effect to be more intense and really stand out as a glowing effect, it's just a case of adding one extra step in there. It's just going back to your white, and right in the center of that light source, I just apply a very small amount of white to that area as well. Now this little recipe can apply to any color scheme, so if you want some red glowing eyes, it's just a very simple case of just simply changing the color of your contrast paint to get that glow effect. At this point, your miniature is now complete, so let's just quickly recap a few key points. While it might seem like we've added extra steps, this approach actually shortens the painting process. Using alternative products like AK True Metallics gives us tons of variation and finishes with just a single application. By polishing that wax, we control the shine, depth and tone without any additional products or layers. The enamels add a realistic grime while subtly shifting the overall look, and the oils push that corrosion and colour variation even further. The bigger takeaway is that experimenting with alternative products opens up the door to new techniques and exciting possibilities for your miniature painting. I hope you have enjoyed this tutorial and taken away some ideas that you can use, and don't forget to check out other videos here on our channel as well as the courses on our website. I've been Nate the Feral Painter, and until next time guys, I will catch you in the next video.